You are listening to Practical and Woo by Mindset and Manifest. My name is Eden, and I invite you to embark on a journey with me to explore the practical and spiritual edges of the unknown for the purpose of allowing you to embody and empower yourself uniquely as you are, and to intentionally create and live a life of freedom and fulfillment. Each week, I am going to discuss topics such as energetics, reality creation, manifestation, astrology, tarot, and more to help empower you to live beyond perceived limitations and to practically design your life so it feels like absolute magic every step of the way. Let's dive in. Well, hello, brilliant soul. Growing up, the adults in my life would often justify themselves with sentiments like, "This is just the way I am," or "I've always been this way and you just have to get used to it," or "You can't teach an old dog new tricks." And for a while, I allowed myself to believe these idioms, and I have no doubt that they're calcified beliefs in those who would state them to me. And being immersed in this particular practically spiritual corner of the world that we're finding ourselves in together, I have come to believe myself more and more that this is simply not the truth. And so if you feel you're beyond the point of no return on adjusting, improving, or changing anything about yourself, then this episode will serve to help shift your perspective away from the rigid belief that you've missed your opportunity and towards the knowing that your potential is always one choice away, no matter how old or traumatized or anything you've been up until this point. While it's true that we as humans do develop behavioral grooves and emotional habits and neurological efficiencies, defense reflexes, coping patterns, and adaptations that become deeply conditioned in us over time. And that repetition creates familiarity, and familiarity creates efficiency in the body. None of this equation equates to an inability to change. The truth we must become privy to is that when someone says, "I can't change," the subtext is actually a sense of not being able to fathom or perhaps even survive the destabilization that would be required of that person in order to be successful at changing. Human beings will often defend what's familiar with a greater intensity than what is healthy for them. And this is why people stay stuck far longer than they stay incapable. The phrase, "You can't teach an old dog new tricks," subtly removes agency, responsibility, and choice from possibility. It frames change as though learning is something that evaporates with time. And even though we technically complete schooling and education at a designated time in our lives, are we truly ever done with learning? And if we're never done with learning, which I don't think we are, wouldn't our ability to learn indicate the possibility of evolution, which is synonymous with change? Because what is learning really? When we reduce the concept of learning to encapsulate only formal education with classrooms and textbooks and certifications and exams, we imagine that learning is a phase or a stage that solely belongs to a developmental chapter of life rather than to life itself. Yet human beings are learning constantly, whether consciously or unconsciously. We learn through heartbreak and through embarrassment. We learn through conflict, grief. We learn through travel. We learn through intimacy. We learn through failure or illness. We learn through cultivating responsibility, through observation, through longing, through consequence. There is no world where a human can move through reality without being shaped by it. And I think this is the pivot point where the entire conversation changes. Because if learning remains possible, then adaptation remains possible. And if adaptation remains possible, then new choices remain possible. And if new choices remain possible, then identity isn't something that can be fixed, as people often pretend that it is. Sure, yes, a person may have deeply ingrained tendencies, and there's no reason to deny this. They may also have reinforced emotional reflexes and decades of conditioning, habits, wounds, fears, coping mechanisms that operate beneath the surface of who they are showing up as. But none of this needs to be permanent. If you have repeated a behavior for 20 years, it will certainly feel natural. But natural and inevitable aren't the same thing. A person who has spent decades criticizing themselves will eventually feel more themselves inside of self-rejection than self-compassion. And someone who has spent decades shutting down emotionally may feel profoundly unnatural in attempting vulnerability. Yet, the emotional sensation of unfamiliarity doesn't prove that something is misaligned, it just shows that something is new. One of the greatest misunderstandings that surrounds the idea of transformation is that it's often expected to feel immediately comfortable. But why would it? If your nervous system has rehearsed one way of being for decades, the introduction of a new behavioral or emotional pattern is going to feel disruptive at first. And this is why change requires humility. And why stating that you can't teach an old dog new tricks feels like a worthy excuse to hide behind. It requires humility to admit that perhaps the self you've been rehearsing is not the only self that's been available to you. And it takes humility to recognize that survival strategies are not always permanent identities. So many of us unconsciously choose to stop learning long before we stop living. We cause ourselves to become emotionally cemented, defensively certain, psychologically overcommitted to our current worldview. We allow ourselves to stop approaching life with curiosity and to begin approaching it with definitive answers. It's the curious person who can still evolve because they're the ones who are in conversation with reality. They're the ones who allow themselves to observe and ask and make adjustments and are open to possibilities that completely destabilize old assumptions that they used to buy into. True evolution requires a willingness to let new information interrupt old identities, and this can feel profoundly vulnerable because it's our identities that create the emotional structures that shape our relationships, our self-worth, what's predictable to us, and how we feel we belong. If someone spent their entire life being anxious or angry or the caretaker or someone misunderstood or even lazy or the one who's hyper independent or the people pleaser, then changing doesn't only require behavioral adjustment, it requires a willingness to grieve a self-concept that once felt like home, even if it was a false home that you've outgrown or if it's one that's not truly serving you. Even painful identities can become strangely comforting once they become known territory to you, because at least you know the rules there, and at least you know how people respond to you there, and at least you know who you are there. Transformation asks us to temporarily loosen our grip on certainty because our new sense of self hasn't yet fully stabilized. A person who is learning confidence may initially feel arrogant because they are unfamiliar with taking up space. A person who's learning how to hold boundaries may initially feel cruel because they're accustomed to abandoning themselves. A person learning emotional regulation may initially feel emotionally muted because chaos is their baseline. A person who's learning how to respect themselves more may initially feel lonely because many of their previous dynamics depended on the absence of the respect that they did have for themselves. Growth can feel disorienting precisely because it changes the internal reference point from which you've lived. But again, disorientation is not evidence of impossibility, and old dogs can learn new tricks. Science is cracking open the framework on this line of thinking. We know that neuroplasticity exists, as well as behavioral change and emotional regulation. People are able to recover from addiction after decades. People are finally gaining the courage to leave toxic marriages at 70 years old. People discover purpose after retirement. People learn emotional regulation after entire lifetimes of experiencing volatility. People soften after years of being rigid. People become artists and healers and lovers and leaders, students, parents, adventurers, and creators long after the world implied that their developmental window had closed. As human beings, we are astonishingly adaptable, and the power lies in the choice to make the move. The recipe for real change asks your nervous system to relinquish predictability and requires your ego to survive unfamiliarity. It asks your personality to tolerate temporary incoherence and asks your mind to stop worshiping certainty. Real change asks your body to become curious and to explore and to enter new territory before it is classified as safe. So the invitation here is to learn to become kind, compassionate, and curious with yourself as well as the experience in which you're having. I personally think modern culture often confuses gentleness with the removal of all challenge altogether. Yet, so many forms of suffering are not actually softened through avoidance, but they're instead prolonged through it. The person who refuses difficult conversations in order to avoid discomfort eventually suffers consequences of disconnection. The person who avoids financial literacy in order to avoid their anxiety eventually suffers consequences of dependence. The person who avoids vulnerability in order to avoid rejection eventually suffers the consequence of loneliness. The person who avoids their own health challenges because they feel they're inconvenient eventually suffers the consequence of deterioration. Avoidance doesn't erase pain, it redistributes it across time, and often with the addition of paid interest. And one of the most fascinating things about being human is how quickly we normalize our own prison once we've decorated them with our own explanation. We can spend years and years building intellectual narratives around why we simply can't evolve. My parents were like this. My brain works differently. I've always struggled with this. I'm stubborn. I'm bad at communication. I'm not disciplined. I'm not a gym person. I'm not good with money. I'm too emotional. I'm too old. And of course, we all have different starting points, different wounds, different neurobiology, conditioning, trauma, environments, different capacities, challenges than each other, than one another. No one person is alike in where they're originating from. Reality is incredibly nuanced in this way and in so many ways. Yet we must name that there's a danger that emerges when explanation becomes justification, which turns into how we permanently identify ourselves, especially when it's a detriment to our own ability to create our own most fulfilling, meaningful, remarkable, and magical life. Eventually, the story we've convinced ourselves of stops describing the reason we used to justify and starts solidifying it as who we'll always be. People have this habit of becoming loyal to continuity even when it's destroying them. There's something psychologically seductive about remaining recognizable to yourself. And while reinvention sounds glamorous in theory, in practice it feels disorienting because it temporarily interrupts your identity continuity. Your nervous system likes knowing who you are, and your social ecosystem likes knowing who you are. And your behavioral habits like knowing who you are. Even your suffering becomes part of your internal system of orientation. This is why some people unconsciously recreate familiar misery after periods of growth. It's not because they're consciously desiring to suffer, but because familiar feels safer to them than the unknown self. And the miserable self in this case, and frankly so many cases, is the one that feels the most familiar. So, the invitation here is to throw the balls against the wall and summon the courage to embrace what's known and feels unfamiliar. We must allow ourselves to navigate the awkwardness and the temporary discomfort of being a beginner, no matter how old we are or when we choose to start. One of the most disempowering things that we can do as humans is to prematurely conclude ourselves. to decide that our story is already written, to decide that growth belongs only to the younger generation, or to decide that the door has already closed on our ability to heal or be loved or reinvent ourselves or to transform. Instead, let's remind ourselves to be active participants in our own emergence, approaching life with wide eyes and zest and the willingness to experiment and to play. Let's embrace the daily courage to interrupt our own patterns and to stop justifying the things that are holding us back from experiencing our best self. Let's embrace the courage to become teachable again and to survive being imperfect while we're still learning. There's immense power in becoming someone who can say, yes, this pattern has existed for a long time and has become familiar to me, and I understand why it's formed, but I'm still capable of becoming more than this. Because if you choose not to consciously participate in your evolution, life will still shape you, but it'll shape you in accordance to that which is so often holding you back and making you suffer. And I think there's something profoundly hopeful in realizing that identity is a living process that evolves alongside the choices you choose and the skills that you hone. You're not required to remain psychologically loyal to every form or version of yourself, and you're allowed to outgrow your own narratives. The old dog does learn new tricks, and not because it suddenly becomes young again, but because it finally stops worshiping the old tricks that no longer work. So, are you willing to release your long-standing relationship with your own comfortable, albeit painful familiarity long enough to allow you to discover who you could become beyond it? There's a version of your life waiting on the other side of patterns you once believed were permanent. There are conversations you're capable of having that you couldn't have had 5 years ago. There are emotional states that you're capable of embodying that once felt completely out of reach to you. No one becomes new by waiting to feel entirely safe. And perhaps the most beautiful thing about being human is that until your final breath, life continues offering you invitations to evolve. No matter what kind of dog you are, you can always learn new tricks. Until next time.